The film opens with a troubled couple trying to escape from the wilderness. They see a random car parked on a track right outside the woods, so they try to run toward it, but something gets to them. The girl survives and makes it to the car, but the unfortunate boy gets possessed. When the girl tries to start the car engine, her man spawns out of nowhere and pushes her out of the car. The scene then shifts to a New Year's party where a cameraman named Milo is filming everyone and trying to get everyone to confess to their New Year's resolutions. As he roams around the partying house, he comes across a very attractive young woman named Sarah who's popping some pills to get high in the bathroom. When Milo asks for her New Year's resolution, she confesses to quitting getting high on pills. Milo and Sarah end up staying in the bathroom for a long time and introducing each other, through which it is revealed that Sarah is the new news reporter in the firm where Milo works as the cameraman. The two spend their New Year mingling in the bathroom. After the party, Milo follows Sarah from a distance and records her. When he is done stalking Sarah, he goes back to his place and cuddles with his pet dog before going to bed. The scene then cuts to a few days after, where Milo is seen getting upset about their old male reporter retiring and being replaced by a new young reporter named Charlie. While greeting Charlie, Milo sets the record straight and calls him a douchebag to his face. The same day, Milo and the reporters are sent to cover the story of a man named Leonard who works for a mortgage company and takes repossession of houses whose mortgages aren't paid on time. And on their way, Sarah tries to convince Milo to be nice and welcoming to their new fellow Charlie, but Milo doesn't see that happening anytime soon. As they reach their location, Leonard takes them to the first house he has to take the repossession of. Milo is asked to film the house from various angles while Sarah and Charlie catch up in the kitchen. During this, Milo eavesdrops on them instead of doing his job and gets envious of Charlie. Soon, Leonard announces to pack up since he's going to visit the last house whose possession he has to take. Hence, Milo and his crew follow the man to his last stop. When everyone walks into the house that was to be checked by the cleaning agency, everyone notices that the house is fully furnished and the power is still running. As they further roam around, they notice pictures pasted on the refrigerator, some photo frames, and food on the dinner table that indicates someone has left the place in the middle of their breakfast. Furthermore, they come across the landline phone, which has a couple of unopened voicemails from the concerned colleagues, office staff, and the school teachers from their kid Tara's school. Just when things around the house perfectly align and showcase that the family was brutally kicked out and wasn't given the chance to take their possessions with them, Milo heads down to the basement and discovers some weird symbols that are painted with black paint all over the walls. He immediately shouts Leonard's name and tells him to come down to the basement and take a look over the situation. Before Leonard, Charlie sneaks into the basement with a torchlight and scares Milo. As expected, Milo becomes scared and runs out of breath. Since he hasn't bonded with Charlie, he strictly tells him to not joke around him. As the two laugh things off, they come across a locked cabinet under the basement staircase. They get Leonard to break the lock with his bolt cutters. Inside the cabinet, they find some dusty canvases and cartons full of cassettes. However, they make a good case on the mortgage company and take possession of the cassettes to find any proof of whether or not the family was kicked out of their home. After this, Sarah, Milo, and Charlie go out to celebrate getting a good lead on the family that's missing from the house. But something doesn't sit right with Milo. He confesses his boredom caused by all the tapes he has to go through to find any solid proof, but Sarah tries to convince him to stay devoted to his work. Later that night, Sarah goes to Milo's editing room and tries to convince him to keep going through the cassettes, but he reignites their old hookup at New Year and makes Sarah angry. She becomes upset due to this and leaves the room. The next morning, the news crew shows up at the mortgage firm and interviews the owner for his take on this missing family situation. The owner addresses that the entire family went missing before the mortgage company could kick them out for not paying their installments, and clears doubts on his company's end. Subsequently, the news crew goes to the house of the missing family, where Sarah records a brief report to address the issue. The team then splits up and interviews people who are associated with the family. They visit their neighbor first, who makes some weird claims about the family's son, Jeremy, who disappeared. He entails a beach barbecue event with the missing family. His family joined Dan, his wife Rose, and their children Tara and Jeremy at a picnic, where Jeremy went for a swim and got hit by a boat. The scene then cuts to interviewing one of Dan's neighbors, who claims Dan's mental health and overall behavioral shift after Jeremy's tragedy. She states that after the accident, Dan became paranoid and kept filming everything around him, especially events like birthday parties. One day, she went out for jogging and caught Dan standing in the backyard and staring at the woods. He had his camera pointed toward the woods as if he was seeing something, but the neighbor couldn't get a glimpse of what he was trying to record. Subsequent to this interview, the new reporting crew heads to the town's police station, where one of the officers comes forward and confesses to receiving a call from Dan once. According to the police, Dan continuously requested help from the police and had claimed that he was being followed by a stalker in the woods nearby his house. When the police went to his house and patrolled the entire area, they found no hint of the stalker Dan was talking about, yet Dan kept ranting about a stalker who lived in a tree on his property. While Sarah and Charlie are still outside the police sheriff's office, Milo's boss, Barbara, comes to his room and becomes disappointed to see him working without his team. At that moment, Milo grabs the monitor and the tapes and drives the office van straight to Sarah and Charlie. While still baffled by the discovery, he replays some cassettes of the missing family and points out a ghastly human-like figure that can be seen at distances in many clips. He plays a clip where Rose is celebrating Tara's birthday in their backyard among Tara's school friends. Unbeknownst to them, the ghastly figure is seen at a distance, standing still. In another clip, Dan is seen trying to prove to his wife, Rose, that he sees a figure in the camera, but when he tries to see the figure in real life, it disappears. Rose becomes agitated and doesn't believe that her husband can see things that are only visible in the camera. Once again, unbeknownst to them, the ghastly figure is seen standing outside their windows, eavesdropping on their conversation. Milo points out that every time the anonymous figure pops up in the footage, it messes with the camera's sound system and creates weird distortion. Now, the trio stops by another place to discuss the possibility of whether or not the family was targeted by a serial murderer, whereas their boss, Barbara, grows agitated about the Three Musketeers not showing up at work. After a few hours, when the trio reaches outside the office, they find Barbara awaiting their arrival outside the building. She takes them back into the building and reassigns their assignment by shutting down Dan's case. She sends them to interview and cover another guy whom they've helped once in the past. Since the trio is out of options, Milo takes one for the team and takes all the cassettes of Dan and his family back to his place, where he has a good PC setup that even Charlie appreciates. Milo was least interested in this case, but he is now willing to do anything to uncover the mystery of the mysterious stalker. That night, Milo goes through a few clips and notices that the ghastly entity is vigorously stalking the entire family. The entity was even spotted outside the school of Dan's little daughter, Tara. In another clip, Dan finally succeeds in proving to his wife, Rose, the existence of the stalker by pointing the camera outside and getting the footage of the entity standing underneath a tree. Through the footage, it can be noticed that the entity has no face, but however, it suits up in a tuxedo just like a man. Rose gets the creeps and immediately tells Dan to shut the camera. Despite being invested in the mystery, Milo decides to bail and go to sleep. Not moments after he cuddles with his pet dog, his house's power goes out and his dog starts barking at random corners of the house. Simultaneously, Milo hears some noises from upstairs, so he picks up his camera and tours his entire house to see if anything's wrong. At last, he goes to the kitchen to take a look at the power circuit. He places the camera on one of the counters and looks into the circuit. That's the moment when his camera records the mysterious entity standing a few steps away from Milo, unbeknownst to him. Although Milo has his doubts, so he goes to his storage unit to take out some cable wires and a camera stand. Thankfully, the power comes back on, which relieves Milo. He goes to his hall and immediately turns on his TV and a CCTV camera. He also sets up his main camera on the stand and faces it in his direction. That night, he falls asleep on the couch while the entire hall is being filmed. Moments after he dozes off on the couch, the lights flicker and change color due to an unusual power surge in the house's power supply, and some waves meddle with the camera footage too. He gets up in the middle of the night and checks his old camera films, where he comes across a film in which the mysterious entity is standing on his house's front porch. Milo becomes convinced that Dan's lingering stalker has come out of the tapes to target him. He rushes into his car and decides to grab the leftover tapes from Dan's house, the ones open for investigation purposes. On his way, he calls Charlie to make him aware of his whereabouts, but the call goes directly to voicemail. Despite being scared, Milo steps into Dan's basement and comes across a box full of family photos that have been tilted on the ground. When he bends over to pick it up, the basement door closes on its own, convincing Milo that Charlie has come for him. When Milo goes near the door, a cleaning hover falls on the floor as if someone has grabbed it and thrown it on the floor on purpose. This scares the living hell out of him, so he runs out of the basement and gets into his car. He comes back home and takes out an old projector. He connects his camera to the projector and places the camera in his dining room. The dining room footage is projected on the hall's chimney wall, which gives Milo a sense of relief and protection. Milo tries to stay awake so that he can catch the entity in his camera live. Once again, without Milo finding out about the entity, it shows up in the dining room and its projection is seen on Milo's shirt while he's trying to fix the projector. After struggling to stay awake, Milo dozes off, allowing the entity to come closer to him and brand a satanic symbol on his collarbone. Milo wakes up with a burning sensation and discovers the branded symbol on his neck. That's when he realizes the symbol resembles the one that he saw in Dan's basement. As he's processing all this, he hears his dog bark outside in the open field. He takes his camera out and finally catches the live footage of the entity standing at a distance. Milo yells at his dog to come back and curses at the entity. With a flinch, the entity travels across the open field and comes very close to Milo, which shakes his ground. He immediately runs back into his house in a state of panic and grabs his camera that's fixed on a handstand. Along with his cam, he goes to Sarah's house and wildly knocks on her door. However, when Sarah doesn't answer the door, Milo picks up a spare key from under a plant pot that's on Sarah's front porch and unlocks the door. Milo knows about the spare key because he used to stalk Sarah and often film her going in and out of her house. He goes inside the house and lands straight into her room, where he catches Sarah and Charlie dressing themselves up after their intimate lovemaking session. Whereas they expect Milo to get mad, Milo breaks down and tries to tell them about what he's been experiencing. But his bad communication and his unintentional privacy invasion get him kicked out of Sarah's house. He stays outside the door for a while and tries to beg Sarah to let him in, but when he doesn't get any response, he goes back into his car and calls 911. However, he pulls himself together and cuts the call, realizing no one is going to believe him. Then, he goes to a store to buy some sodas and chips to munch on and goes back into his house where he finds his dog squealing near the staircase. So he goes upstairs to his computer room, only to discover Charlie going through his camera films and finding about his creepy obsession with filming Sarah from a distance like a stalker. Charlie loses his temper and calls Milo out for being a stalker, who is purposefully rude to him because he doesn't want to see him with Sarah, but sadly that's the least of Milo's worries for now. Soon, Sarah shows up at Milo's house and scolds Charlie for showing up at this hour, whereas they agreed on seeing Milo the next morning. The trio gets into a loud argument when Charlie tells Sarah about her secretly being stalked and filmed by Milo. As Charlie and Sarah become mad, Milo tries to warn them of the entity. At the same time, Milo's cameras pick up some signals of the entity and he becomes heavily afraid. As he runs out of words to warn the other two, Charlie picks up the camera to shut down the recording, but the entity shows up and breaks the camera. The glass of the camera scatters everywhere on the ground and the lights get rendered useless. Weirdly, the entity's existence turns out to be in Milo's favor as Charlie and Sarah forget about his creepy act and start fearing the unknown being. Everyone, including the dog, immediately runs out of the house and gets into Milo's car. Milo decides to keep driving, but Charlie yells at him and reminds him that the entity can follow them anywhere they go since it's not bound to anything. Sarah emphasizes calling the cops, but Charlie strictly prohibits Sarah and Milo from calling the cops since they were of no use to Dan when he was experiencing all this earlier. The trio ends up booking a room at a local motel, where Milo sets up his cameras, projectors, and monitor screens all across the room. He then plays a few cassettes taken from Dan's basement and witnesses the entity messing with Dan's family. In one of the clips, Dan finds a symbol branded on his collarbone, which looks exactly the same as Milo's. Dan then discovers the entity standing inside one of the rooms in his house, so he tries to aim and shoot at it with his gun. Since it doesn't exist outside of cameras, he fails to shoot it. He then hears Tara screaming in her room, so he rushes to her and finds out she's been branded by the entity too. The only difference is that her branded symbol is on her belly. He takes Tara to the hall so that Rose can further look into what's happened to Tara. Unfortunately, he finds Rose scrubbing her wrist in the kitchen sink, which has been branded by the entity too. The clip ends when Rose becomes paranoid and tells Dan to move out of the house immediately. As the trio runs out of Dan's video clips, they discuss all the possible reasons why the entity is following them and if they can get rid of it or not. Their discussion ends with a mutual agreement upon finding out where Dan and his family went. Milo gets up and goes to the bathroom along with his camera and dresses the burnt mark on his collarbone. The following night, Charlie and Sarah sleep one after another, leaving Milo on the lookout duty. Sadly, Milo dozes off as well, allowing the entity to intrude into their room while they're sleeping the night off. The next morning, Milo wakes up and finds Sarah gone. He starts panicking and wakes Charlie up, believing she's been taken away by the evil entity. Much to their relief, Sarah shows up at the door and tells them to calm down since she only went for a stroll to get some fresh air. At the same time, Charlie gets a call from one of his links that he used to track Dan and his family. Through the link, Charlie finds out Dan's current address because he used the address to order something online. The trio packs everything up and sets on a long road trip, along with their dog, to find Dan. Before leaving, Milo notices the same burnt mark on Charlie's abs while he's putting on his t-shirt. However, no one panics this time. As the night falls, Charlie and Sarah sleep, leaving Milo to drive the car on his own. As Milo gets on a deserted road, the car's headlights start to flicker and the car slowly stops, provoking Milo to get out of his car. While he's trying to get a look at the engine, the camera inside the car spots the entity standing right behind Milo. Gradually, the entity appears closer to Milo and casts him under its spell. Soon, Sarah wakes up and processes the current situation. When she doesn't see Milo inside the car, she panics and wakes Charlie up. Before they get out, the very much hypnotized Milo bumps into Sarah's side of the car and gets back into his senses. He tells Sarah about the headlight glitch and immediately gets back into his car since it's supposedly working fine. The trio decides to find another motel to stay the night since they are all tired. While Charlie and Milo take positions in front of the monitors and await the evil entity, Sarah locks herself in the bathroom and starts crying loudly. Milo grabs his camera and goes after Charlie as he forcefully opens the bathroom door. Sarah shows them the burnt mark on her symbol that resembles the one Rose had on her wrist. In a fit of rage, Sarah relapses into her pill addiction and tries to swallow a handful of pills. This ignites a huge fight between Charlie and Milo, because he wants to inspect what else Sarah has bought in her bag. Milo only wants to be sure that Sarah is not on pills again, but Charlie finds it an invasion of privacy. He attacks Milo when he doesn't back off. As their fight reaches its peak and Charlie grabs Milo's projector to hit Milo with it, an unseen force enters the motel room, leaving the door wide open and pushing Charlie away in the opposite direction. In their rolling cameras, the entity is shown entering the room, so Sarah immediately alerts the boys and tells them to get out of the place since the entity has followed them here too. This time, the trio takes turns driving the car since everyone is sleepy. At one point, Charlie becomes very sleepy and parks the car at the side of a deserted road. Before they sleep, Charlie suggests shutting down the cameras since they are the only source through which it bothers them. Now, Milo gets convinced and turns off the cameras. Everyone wakes up the next morning with Milo screaming because he found his dog lifeless in the backseat. He picks a fight with Charlie for turning off the cameras and later buries his dog nearby. After a rough journey, the trio becomes disappointed to see Dan's place burnt to ashes. Before they leave, Milo finds a lid on the ground. When he opens that lid, it leads them to a basement which has a monitor screen. Through that screen, the trio gets access to the cameras that were set up in every corner of Dan's current house. In the footage, Dan becomes possessed by the entity and loses consciousness. Sleeping daughter's face with a pillow and takes her life. He then stands near the staircase like a lifeless zombie. When his wife discovers what he has done to their daughter, she not only pushes him off the staircase but she sets the entire house on fire. She sits down on the couch and awaits her demise with her baby girl's play doll in her hands. At this shocking revelation, the trio calls the cops and finds out that Rose still lives after the fire incident and is currently put in a mental facility. When they approach her in her cell, Sarah tries to talk to her about her husband, but she notices the burnt mark on her wrist and attacks her while yelling she's brought the entity along with her. The trio is forced to leave Rose and stay the night at a guest house, where they make the final encounter with the entity, and this results in their demise. Before the entity approaches, Milo rewatches his filmed video from the mental hospital and points out that Rose's burnt mark from her wrist has vanished now that her family is gone. He assumes that one of the members has to be a sacrifice in order to get the lingering evil out of their lives. When the entity shows up, Milo immediately takes out a rope and the ceiling beam. As he passes away, Charlie assures the crying Sarah that everything is going to be fine, but much to their Milo's body is taken by the entity, which makes him bash Charlie's head open with a bat and find the escaped Sarah. The entity throws Sarah back into the guest house and bashes her head open too. It then comes out of Milo's body, leaving the trio lifeless under the same roof. The film ends with one of Dan's clips which explains the entire plot of the movie. In the film, he discusses with his wife about buying a cheap camera from a garage sale that came along with a tape, so they didn't have to buy a new one to start the recording. Rose isn't comfortable, so she tells him to take out the tape and put it back. When Dan reaches for the case to put the tape back in it, the case is labeled with the same mark that was appearing in the entire film.